Rome never sold water. It was a gift from the emperor to his people. And yet, in the year 97 AD, a single man discovered that someone was getting rich off every single drop flowing through the imperial aqueducts. His name was Sextus Julius Frontinus. Newly appointed as Rome's chief water commissioner, Frontinus unrolled the imperial ledgers, looked at the roaring stone aqueducts spanning the capital, and realized something didn't add up. Over 40% of the water entering the city simply vanished before it reached the public fountains. It wasn't evaporating. It was being stolen, franchised, and monetized. Welcome to the economics of Imperial Rome's private water utility, a system where the state built the world's most expensive public infrastructure, and private cartels captured the profits. An ancient metropolis was a place of extreme biological and operational density. Multi-story timber and brick apartment blocks packed hundreds of thousands of residents into tight urban quarters. Fire was a constant threat, sanitation was a matter of survival, and commercial enterprises required reliable inputs to function. The Tiber River, sitting at the bottom of Rome's hills, was heavily polluted by urban runoff, while shallow ground wells were prone to contamination and rapidly exhausted. These physical constraints created a market where the price elasticity of demand for fresh water was virtually zero. Urban citizens and commercial operators could not simply choose an alternative input. Fresh, pressurized water was biologically necessary for human life and operationally necessary for commercial enterprise. Fulling mills required continuous water flow to clean textiles. Tanneries needed it to process hides. Flour mills relied on hydraulic head pressure to turn heavy millstones, and neighborhood bathhouses needed constant supply to fill their basins. Harvesting this water, however, presented a formidable engineering and financial challenge. Roman aqueducts were zero-fuel gravity engines. They possessed no mechanical pumps. Water flowed continuously from mountain springs to urban centers, through a precisely engineered downward gradient, often dropping as little as 1 meter for every 2,000 meters of linear distance. Constructing these masonry conduits required tunneling through mountains, bridging valleys with multi-tiered stone arcades, and lining channels with water-resistant mortar, because the initial capital expenditure of building long-distance trunk lines was immense. Private capital could not build the core infrastructure independently. The imperial treasury, war booty, and wealthy political figures financed the trunk lines to project power and maintain social stability. But once the water reached the city walls, the state faced a secondary challenge: how to allocate and monetize a continuous, high-volume, fluid asset inside a dense urban grid. The transition from public infrastructure to private utility occurred at the Castellum Aquae, the primary distribution tower situated at the high point of the city walls. Water from the main aqueduct channel flowed into this masonry header tank, where it passed through stone sluices and bronze grates. In many imperial distribution towers, the intake was divided internally into 3 primary supply lines: one for public drinking fountains, one for public imperial baths, and one designated specifically for private commercial franchises. To tap into this third channel, private individuals and business owners had to apply directly to the emperor or the city water board, the cura aquarum. If approved, the state granted a personal, non-transferable tapping right. The grant specified the exact diameter of the connection point, using a standardized bronze nozzle known as a calyx. This bronze fitting was built directly into the stone wall of the distribution tower to prevent the licensee from widening the intake aperture. Once the grant was secured, the private franchise owner assumed full financial responsibility for downstream infrastructure. The licensee hired private plumbers and contractors to cast heavy lead sheets, roll them into oval pipes known as fistulae, and lay dedicated underground pipelines from the public distribution tower directly to their private property. These pipelines frequently stretched hundreds of meters beneath public streets, representing a substantial private capital outlay. The primary commercial anchor tenants of this network were neighborhood bathhouses, known as Bottleneck, while massive imperial megabaths provided subsidized leisure for the masses. Hundreds of smaller, privately owned bathhouses operated as for-profit enterprises across Rome's residential quarters. A bathhouse operator acquired a private water grant to secure a continuous inflow of fresh water for hot baths, warm rooms, and cold plunge basins. These commercial operators generated revenue through a sophisticated strategy of revenue stacking. Bathers paid a basic entry fee at the door. Inside, the operator monetized secondary services, selling food, wine, oil rubs, and massage treatments. Furthermore, the operator captured tertiary value from wastewater. Used water cascading out of the bath basins was channeled downstream into private commercial latrines, or leased to nearby industrial fullers and tanners who relied on continuous water flow to wash wool and process leather. By monetizing primary access, secondary concessions, and tertiary wastewater, The private franchise owner turned a single upstream water connection into a multi-layered commercial enterprise. For over a century, the Roman aqueduct was celebrated as a masterpiece of public infrastructure. But what looked like an untouchable monument of imperial power had one fatal weakness. It was completely unmetered. Rome had built a massive hydraulic engine, but it had no way to measure velocity or pressure. And in the shadows of that technical blind spot, a shadowy network of corrupt plumbers and bathhouse cartels found their gold mine. On paper, the imperial water administration appeared perfectly organized. In reality, operating a high-volume, unmetered fluid network created immense administrative friction, physical decay, and opportunities for criminal arbitrage. The fundamental flaw in Roman water economics was the absence of volumetric flow meters. The cura aquarum possessed no mechanism to measure water velocity or pressure. Official water grants were issued strictly based on the cross-sectional diameter of the bronze nozzle, measured in standardized units called quinarii. Imperial administrators assumed that a pipe of a given diameter would always deliver a predictable volume of water. This technical limitation created a massive information asymmetry that private plumbers and corrupt officials exploited for profit. Water delivery volume depends not just on pipe diameter, but on hydraulic pressure and flow velocity. By installing a lead pipe with a wider internal diameter immediately downstream from the official bronze nozzle, or by connecting to the distribution tower at a lower elevation where pressure head was higher, private operators could draw significantly more water than their official license permitted. Furthermore, a lucrative black market in illegal tapping, known as Punctura, flourished throughout the system. Plumbers and waterworkers secretly bored holes directly into main subterranean conduits or distribution tanks outside the city walls. They attached unrecorded lead pipes that ran secretly into private agricultural estates, commercial brickworks, and unlicensed bathhouses. When Sextus Julius Frontinus was appointed Water Commissioner of Rome in the late 1st century, his comprehensive audit revealed that more than 40% of the water entering the city's trunk lines was unaccounted for, diverted through unrecorded private connections, or pocketed by corrupt staff. Beyond human corruption, the system faced relentless physical degradation. Mountain spring water throughout central Italy was heavily saturated with calcium carbonate. As water flowed through masonry conduits and lead pipes, dissolved minerals precipitated out, forming thick layers of hardstone calcification known as sinter. Over time, this mineral crust choked aqueduct channels, reducing cross-sectional flow capacity by 30% or more if left untreated. Maintaining these conduits required a continuous, labor-intensive operational expenditure. The state maintained two dedicated workforces of public and imperial slaves, the Familia Publica and the Familia Caesaris, whose daily responsibility was to enter dark, subterranean tunnels, scrape calcification off masonry walls, patch hydraulic mortar, and repair leaking lead joints. When maintenance crews failed to keep pace with calcification, water pressure at urban distribution towers dropped, triggering immediate revenue losses for downstream commercial franchises. Despite heavy maintenance burdens and pervasive illegal tapping, the Roman aqueduct franchise system endured for centuries. It persisted because the underlying economic structure created an exceptionally strong competitive moat protected by geography, capital barriers, and state power. The primary layer of this moat was the insurmountable capital barrier of the main trunk line. A private entrepreneur could afford to lay a few hundred meters of lead pipe from an urban distribution tower to a local bathhouse. No private consortium, however, possessed the financial reserves required to survey, tunnel, and build a 50-mile stone aqueduct from a mountain source down to the coast. Construction of a single major line like the Aqua Claudia required hundreds of millions of sesterces, an outlay equivalent to a substantial fraction of the entire empire's annual tax revenue. The state held an absolute natural monopoly over primary transportation infrastructure. The second layer of the moat was statutory and regulatory control over tapping rights. Roman law established that water flowing through public conduits was sovereign property. Private tapping grants were issued personally by the emperor and were legally non-transferable. When a private property owner or bathhouse operator died, or when a commercial property was sold, the water grant immediately expired. The rights did not automatically pass to heirs or buyers. This non-transferable framework prevented private families or commercial cartels from establishing permanent property rights over public water channels. To maintain water access, heirs and new property owners were forced to reapply to the state, submit to fresh inspections, and pay new administrative fees. If a commercial operator engaged in political disloyalty or defaulted on obligations, the city water board could simply remove the bronze nozzle at the distribution tower, severing the business's water supply in a single morning. Furthermore, The state maintained physical custody of the central distribution towers. Municipal authorities retained the absolute power to adjust sluice gates inside the Castellum Aquae. During summer droughts, or technical maintenance emergencies, the state routinely shut off supply to private commercial franchises and private villas first, preserving full flow for public drinking fountains and civic hygiene. Private operators were captive tenants of a sovereign utility provider. To evaluate the financial dynamics of a Roman water franchise, one must reconstruct the unit economics of a private commercial operation using historical administrative records, legal codes, and archaeological estimates. Consider an illustrative economic model for a medium-sized private neighborhood bathhouse in Rome during the 1st century, measured in sesterces. To understand what this meant for a private operator like Caius, consider the math. Laying a dedicated lead pipe from the main distribution tower to his bathhouse required an upfront investment equivalent to purchasing several luxury Roman villas in a prime district. On top of that, his annual payoffs and official utility fees absorbed the cost of a small farm every single year. It sounded like a crushing financial risk. But because thousands of Romans paid a daily entry fee, and because Caius resold his spent wastewater to local tanners, that massive initial investment was paid off in less than 3 years. After that, his bathhouse became a cash printing machine, yielding profit margins over 60%. Higher than almost any legal business in the empire. Under normal economic conditions, this model provided exceptionally stable cash flow. Because urban population density was high, and water demand was inelastic, customer volume remained predictable year after year. The initial capital expenditure for lead piping was typically recovered within 2 to 4 years of continuous operation. However, during crisis periods, such as a prolonged summer drought at the mountain springs, or a structural collapse of a masonry arcade outside the city, the business model failed instantly. Because the bathhouse possessed no alternative water source, an interruption at the public distribution tower reduced commercial revenue to zero overnight, while property leases, fuel inventory, and staff expenses remained completely unhedged. For over 500 years, the aqueduct networks of the Roman Empire appeared permanent. They were backed by imperial capital, protected by statutory laws, and anchored in the daily habits of millions of urban residents. Yet, like all complex infrastructure systems, they were ultimately dismantled when military conflict, fiscal decay, and urban depopulation broke the primary supply chain. The structural weakness of the aqueduct system was its extreme physical vulnerability outside city walls. To maintain a gentle downward slope across undulating terrain, aqueduct channels were carried above ground on elevated masonry arcades for miles before reaching urban centers. These exposed stone arches presented an irresistible target for invading armies. During the Gothic Wars of the 6th century, when Ostrogothic forces besieged Rome in 537, the invading army systematically smashed the elevated arcades of all 11 aqueducts surrounding the city. They severed the stone channels, diverting millions of gallons of mountain water into the countryside and transforming the surrounding plains into stagnant marshes. In earlier centuries, the imperial state would have immediately mobilized thousands of specialized masons, deployed public funds, and rebuilt the arcades within months. But by the 6th century, the sovereign state was fiscally bankrupt. Imperial tax collection networks had collapsed, trade routes were severed, and the central administration no longer possessed the capital or organizational capacity required to restore long-distance masonry engineering. Without fresh water flowing to the distribution towers, urban commercial life collapsed. Private bathhouses went dark, industrial mills ground to a halt, and public fountains ran dry. Rome's population, which had once exceeded 1 million, plummeted as residents fled the unhygienic, waterless urban core. Citizens abandoned multi-story housing on the hills and resettled in squalid settlements along the banks of the polluted Tiber River. In a matter of weeks, 800 years of hydraulic engineering were undone, returning the city to its archaic pre-aqueduct existence. The story of the Roman aqueduct franchise illustrates a timeless economic principle. Complex societies rely on midstream infrastructure bottlenecks, and whoever controls the intermediate distribution layer will inevitably capture extraordinary economic rents. The Roman imperial state recognized that it did not need to monetize every public fountain to extract value from its infrastructure. By maintaining absolute control over high capital primary trunk lines, it forced commercial capital to build the secondary distribution grid and pay recurring tariffs for access. Private entrepreneurs accepted high upfront connection costs because centralized water delivery offered an irreplaceable input for high-margin urban businesses. The names of the assets change across centuries, but the underlying system never does. Today, Amazon Web Services and Google Cloud do not invent every line of code. They own the digital distribution towers that host the modern economy. Undersea fiber optic cables and power grids are nothing more than the stone arcades of our time. High Capex, bottlenecks charging access tariffs on our daily electricity, internet, and the emerging infrastructure of artificial intelligence. When an essential utility becomes the absolute foundation of human survival and global commerce, can a free market ever truly exist? Or will whoever controls the bottleneck always end up owning the system?